here today to look at the difference between preference and behaviour. In my experience, this is the most widely misunderstood area when it comes to understanding personality type. And when you can get your head around this, the results can be very, very powerful, not just in terms of increasing your insight into yourself and other people, but also in terms of making use of this, turning your understanding and insight into action. So, here we have two different notions, preferences and behaviours. So let's think about this in very simple personality terms. I have a preference for one thing or the other. I have a preference for extroversion, or I have a preference for introversion. Now, psychologists like myself get very excited trying to work out exactly when in our life these two things became set, whether I was extrovert or introvert. Is it genetic? Is it determined by the time we were born, the first few years of our life? Or can it change throughout our life? Well, in my experience, and looking at the research that's been available so far, this is something that's very, very stable in adults. So depending on the age group that you're working with, essentially what you're looking at is something here that's very, very stable. I am either extrovert or introvert. So, if I am an introvert, does that mean that I always have to act in an introverted way? Of course not. I can choose my behaviour. My behaviour, of course, is also one of two things. In any given situation, I can choose to behave in the extroverted way, or I can choose to behave in the introverted way. Now, if I'm an introvert, one of those is going to come much more easily to me than the other. It is always going to be easier for me as an introvert to do introverted behaviour. It's going to come more naturally to me. Think back to folding your arms. It's in most situations even going to charge up my batteries. I'm going to find it more energising. And yet, I could, should I so choose, also, in any given situation, do the extroverted behaviour. This will take more concentration, this will take more effort. In most situations, it's going to reduce the charge in my battery rather than energising me, and yet I can still do it. And in many situations, this might be just the right thing for me to do as well. I think what's very interesting is that over time, if I keep doing the same things, it may be that I get quite good at them. I get quite used to it. Just as I prefer using my right hand, but of course if I kept using my left hand and practicing, I could get quite good. In fact, if I did that for a very long period of time, I might forget that originally I preferred using my right hand. And I often find some people who say, well, I do a bit of both, and that's a very, very common statement when people are coming across personality type, is of course they're right. All of us do both. All of us do extroverted and introverted behaviour at different times during our day. And yet one of those is more energising to us, and one of those is less so. If I have been doing a lot of extroverted and introverted behaviours, and I can't work out which is easiest, here's a question that I often like to ask people. Do you believe that you're an introvert who's learned to do extroverted behaviour, or are you an extrovert who's learned to do introverted behaviour? And of course I could draw up exactly the same dotted lines for the extrovert, but it makes things look a little bit chaotic on here. So, our preferences and our behaviours are two separate aspects of ourselves. If I have a preference for introversion, I'm going to find it easier, more desirable, more energising to do introverted behaviours. And yet, in any given situation, I can also do extroverted behaviours. So, why the distinction? Because for me, understanding what's coming most easily to us, what's energising, is a really useful thing to understand. Because as I said, in most situations, it may be useful to do extroverted behaviour, and yet it will be decharging my batteries. I'll be feeling more worn and more tired. So I can understand this and make use of it. This will be doubly true if I feel that someone is forcing me to adapt my behaviour. So if I feel someone's forcing me to act in an extroverted way, I'm going to find that extra tiring and extra wearing. So, understanding the difference between my preference, which is very stable, and my behaviour, which can change in different circumstances, is going to be very, very useful to me indeed. understanding the principles of preferences and behaviours, as we've seen, is very, very interesting. I want to add in one extra area on here which I think is particularly interesting, and that's around culture. How does my culture affect my preferences and my behaviour? Well, here's the interesting thing. Again, psychologists like me get very excited when we go to different countries and find, a couple of percentage points differences in between the preferences of extroversion and introversion, say. And yet, in reality, extroverts and introverts are very evenly distributed in all sorts of different cultures. In the UK, where I live and do most of my work, the preferences are split almost exactly 50-50. In the US, where I've done some work, interestingly the preferences are about 51-49 in favour of introversion. So why is it we'd see such cultural differences between the UK and the US? And that is because of our behaviour. And our culture affects how we express our behaviour. Our culture affects how we feel we can express ourselves. So, as an introvert, the culture in which I grow up in determines how to express my introversion. So, for example, where I grew up in the US, we generally find that the people from the US, and particularly from the East and West Coast, do more of three particular behaviours associated with extroversion. The volume of their voice tends to be about 10% louder than that is of people from the UK. They do more initiating, meaning that they start more conversations, particularly with people they haven't met before. And in addition, when they are talking to people, they share personal details sooner. So, three clusters of behaviour that are associated with extroversion that a lot of people with extroversion and introversion preferences from the States learn about. Their culture has affected the expression of their personality type. It doesn't mean that introverts and extroverts in the US charge up their batteries in different ways. Of course not. It's just that they express their type in a slightly different way. And of course, culture can mean many, many different things. For example, my culture could mean the subculture that I live in within my broader country. And of course, it could also mean my family. So, for example, I am an extrovert. I grew up in a family where I had two parents who were introverts. And that meant I actually picked up a few introverted habits as I went through my childhood. So, for example, in my family, a great holiday is one where you read a lot of books. So even now, when I go away on holiday, the first thing my dad will say when I get back is, "Oh, how many books did you read?" So, as an extrovert, I've learned a particular habit associated with introversion because of the family culture in which I grew up. So I think it's extremely interesting to reflect back on your family culture and think, okay, how has my family and my national culture even affected how I express my preferences? And that may explain some of the differences between me and other people with the same preferences. And that's why, of course, we're similar to the people with the same preferences as us. We have a lot in common with them, and yet, of course, we are all in our own way unique.